Welcome, everyone. I see everyone is slowly coming into the webinar today. I want to welcome you to today's session. My name is Zach Spicer, and I'm the Director of Research and Outreach with IPAC. And on behalf of IPAC, I'd like to welcome you today to the third webinar in our series. So today we're going to be focusing on the origins and content of the Indian Act. Subsequent webinars will be happening on September 22nd and November 17th. Just a very quick reminder that you can register for the entire series on our website, ipac.ca, to make sure that you don't miss any of the other webinars in this series. Today's event is part of the programming for the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project, which is a national alliance of First Nations, tribal councils, academic researchers, and public sector practitioners that was created to support First Nations leaders and rights holders that have made the decision to transition out from under the Indian Act to their own inherent self-rights governance. IPAC is proud to be part of this work. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge that IPAC's national headquarters is on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and IPAC is grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We are pleased to have viewers joining us today from across the country, and we hope that everyone will take an opportunity to acknowledge the traditional people of the land you work and live on. With that, let me hand things off to Catherine McQuarrie, who is the project manager for the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project and our moderator for today.
Thanks, Zach. Bonjour, Tansi. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this third webinar for our project, Rebuilding First Nations Governance. I want to start today's webinar by acknowledging how very hard the past few weeks have been for Indigenous peoples across the country, as the deep trauma of the residential school system resurfaced for so many, with the unmarked graves of children being confirmed at Kamloops. And possibly it's just the start of many other such confirmations to come. I think for many people, it's been a time of deep sadness as well as anger, many reflective and healing conversations as well. I know I was personally grateful to be able to participate in the national live gatherings that were hosted by Reconciliation Canada. There were many wise words, healing words shared in those sessions, but a particular challenge from hereditary chief of the Galway-Nook First Nations, Chief Dr. Robert Joseph, has continued to echo in my head over these past weeks. And I think it has particular relevance to today's conversations about the Indian Act. He challenged all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, to consider the following. Those little ones have given so much. Now they're giving us an opportunity to change the essence of this country. Who are we going to be after this? And I hope you'll keep that in your mind, not just today as we discuss these important issues, but in the days and weeks and months to come. Before we get to our main topic and our wonderful group of panelists today, as you know, we like to start off in a good way, with an opening prayer, and one of our esteemed panelists, Dwayne Nashkawa, has agreed to give the opening prayer. Over to you, Dwayne. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming to listen to us today. My Anishinaabe name, Nosewan, is Misconquet, and my name is Dwayne Nashwa. I'm working at the same First Nation, and I'm going to share what we call a miigwech for Thanksgiving from the community today. I'm pleased to be sitting right in the community in the nation today. And I'm really honored to have been asked to share this Thanksgiving. So, miigwech Mishoma Sanonik, miigwech Kidnin Nongo Migijka, Wewana Jimino Mazian, miigwech Takukwe, Imijan Mazuin, Imijan Mijan, Imijan Nibi, Imijan Westnia, Imijan Nisewan. Semanga Gidnanan, Guedno, Wabno, Jono, Mera Lingabiono, Eshkam Jijonde, miigwech Mishoma Sanonik, Mina Bukme Sanonik, Kakwejmano Gijemnido, Jenak Duen Migyon, and Ahau, miigwech.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. I just want to note that your microphone was muted somehow. You might have papers in front of your computer, or we didn't, unfortunately, it wasn't all that clear. So we'll hopefully once we get into discussion, we can get that rectified. So our topic today, of course, is the Indian Act, and particularly its relationship to achieving self-government for First Nations in Canada, although no doubt we'll cover a lot of issues associated with this 150-year-old piece of assimilationist. It was deliberately created as an assimilationist piece of law. It has been modified over the years, but continues to embed just about everything for individuals up to governance in communities. And so it's really a very, very important topic for talking about the possibilities of self-government. All of our guests today are deeply experienced in areas of public administration, Indigenous governance, and the legal Indigenous law and the legal issues surrounding construction of self-government in Canada. So it's going to be a treat to hear from all of them. And I missed out on the prep session last week, and I hear it was a wonderful, lively conversation, but I'm sure we'll get them to repeat that all today. I won't go into the bios of each of them. You'll hear today from Satsan, who of course is principal with the Center for First Nations Governance and co-director of our project. I see Terry Passette, currently working in Calgary for the city as the head of Indigenous reconciliation there. But doctorate in public administration, and her thesis particularly on Indian Act band governance. Dwayne Nashkawa, you've already met, a longtime senior administrator for the First Nations, Nipissing First Nations. Dr. Francis Abel, who's also a co-director on our project. And a deep policy and public admin expertise. And of course, last but not least, Naomi Metallic, who's at Dalhousie and is an eminent legal scholar, particularly in issues of Indigenous law. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. If you want to read more about them in more detail, you can go on to our website and you can see their full bios. Just quickly, a couple of housekeeping things before we go in. As you know, this is being recorded and it will be up on our website in a couple of days afterwards, so you can rewatch or recommend to friends to have a look. We have both a chat box where MC and Sheldon will be engaging you in some chatter as we go along. We also have a questions and answers box, and please, if you have questions for the panelists, put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and we will get to the Q&A a little bit later on in the presentations. And we'll start with sort of a round of Q&As that I'll do with our panelists to sort of introduce you to the scope of the issues. and then we'll get into discussions with you. I also want to mention that we have deliberately planned to go beyond an hour today. We'll go at least to 1:30 Eastern Daylight Time, just given the depths and complexity of the subject matter. And we may even run a little longer than that. So if those of you who can stick with us and enjoy the conversation, we'll have lots of time for discussion with you, the panelists. So I'll get going now with our first question to Satsan, who, as I mentioned, is a principal with the Center for First Nations Governance and has been working in this field for many, many years, including in your very early days as a band manager for your First Nations, Satsan. So you've seen it all from the right at the front lines to the more theoretical and philosophical questions of self-government, as well as the legal ones. When you work with communities on that wanted to get going on implementing their inherent right to self-government, one of the key education pieces that you and your team focuses on is, in fact, the Indian Act. And it seems a little counterintuitive if you're talking about self-government. And so I'm wondering why this is so important that people begin with an education about the Indian Act.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and I'd like to welcome all the people who have taken time to tune in and be a part of this very, very important dialogue today. Just in terms of the work we're doing in the communities, rebuilding our nations, implementing our inherent right to self-government. Our people know for a fact that we've been on our territories for thousands and thousands of years, exercising governmental authority over our land and our people. What our people don't realize and know today is the history of our inherent right to self-government in Canada, and what happened and the impact that it had on us as a people, and the impact that it's had on us being off of our lands and not able to fulfill our obligations and responsibilities. And it comes from the fact that as Indigenous people in this country, it's now going on to 8 generations that our people have endured the oppression and suppression of the Indian Act. And when we go into our communities, you know, Aboriginal title and treaty rights and the inherent right to self-government is not the tip of the tongue of our people or the top of the minds of our people, because they've been struggling to survive. It's basically a sustenance lifestyle on a reserve under the Indian Act, on welfare for so long. So it's essential to teach our people about this for one very, very important reason, and that is to build a consensus for change. And what we know from our work in the community, when we've taken our people through the origin and content of the Indian Act, that there is a definite consensus decision for change. And the people will stand up and they'll say, we can't sentence another generation of our people to die under the Indian Act. So that's the importance of it, to be able to make that consensus decision for change and to realize that if we want to make a better future for ourselves and take our rightful place on our own sacred homelands and within Canada, then we have to do that work for ourselves. So that's the importance of it. And I think the importance is also extended to the Canadian public, because I know from my experience and work that the Canadian public is largely ignorant of the fact of the Indian Act. And I've just now in this recent weeks become face to face with it, with the discovery of the 215 graves of our innocent loved ones here in Kamloops, where I live now in Shuswap territory. So this is important overall. So what I'd like to do is to take this opportunity to take people through the origin and content of the Indian Act, and hope that we will all learn something. And I hope that we will all realize at the end of it, the need for change. Just to begin with, this slide is a result of a work that we are doing right now on creating a systems map of the Indian Act to look at how it came to be, what it was designed to do, how it did it, and the fact that it is still doing what it was originally set out to do right today as we speak. So I want to begin with a couple of broad comments just based on our work. First of all, that the Indian Act, in terms of its origin and content, the stated policy objective of the time was clearly extermination. The advertised policy objective then became assimilation. One of the other important questions that one of my colleagues asked me, Dr. Greg Hill from the University of Portland, is when I'm doing this systems work, I always have to ask the question, what is the mechanism that allows the Indian Act to do what it did and what it still is doing? I had to think about that. Next day, I went back to him and I said, I think I've got the answer. The mechanism which allowed the Indian Act to do what it did and still does is the Constitution itself. And that comes from the fact when we were arguing Delgamuukw and Gisteway before the Supreme Court of Canada, counsel for the Wet'suwet'en, Marvin Storrow, brought this to the attention of the court, the Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, and he said, why is it and how is it that the Constitution applies to all Canadians and looks after and protects all Canadians except for Indians under the Indian Act? And why is it that they have to fight their way in? And I think when you listen to this presentation, you'll realize that. First of all, the underlying structure and the mental models of the Indian Act, the colonial ideology of the time, the doctrine of discovery, and terra nullius, are the foundation of the Indian Act. And the doctrine of discovery authorized Christian explorers to claim so-called terra nullius lands, that is nobody's land, vacant lands, on the premise that Indigenous peoples were uncivilized and not Christian. And therefore, the lands were deemed to be empty and vacant. And it was based on the notion of racial and religious superiority, and was used for the colonization of our lands. So that's the underpinning of it all. In 1755, the British Crown established the first Indian department in the military wing of the government. And that was there because the relationship at the time was one of as allies, nation to nation. And of course, there was the 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763 between the British and the French. And through that period, the British were successful, and it changed the relationship. Now we need to get the Indians out of the way for settlement and colonization. So it used the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius to get Indians out of the way for settlement and colonization. And of course, after the 7 Years' War, we have the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the British Crown formally asserts jurisdiction over Indians and Indian lands. And we began to suffer the effects of economic strangulation, where they started to take away our economy and begin the course of oppression. And look at the Royal Proclamation, from my perspective, it's the embodiment of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. And of course, after the 7 Years' War and the Royal Proclamation, the relationship between the indigenous nation and the crown changed. And then we see the precursor colonial legislation, the third row here. Several acts coming from the British Crown and then from the colonies which made up Canada. The first was an act for the better protection of the lands and property of Indians in Lower Canada in 1850. And what's notable there is it established a commissioner to hold lands in trust for Aboriginal peoples, but with the full power to do what he wished with that property. Secondly, an act for the protection of Indians in Upper Canada from imposition in 1850 as well. No one can deal with Indian lands unless the Crown approved. And this legislation is historically notable because together they represent the first instance in which the colonial government took authoritative control to define who was and who was not an Indian. And then we have the Gradual Civilization Act in 1857. And here again, you see the connection to the doctrine of discovery, especially, and terra nullius. And the doctrine, the Gradual Civilization Act made assimilation its goal. And the language of the day was that they need to turn the Indians into English Indians without connection to their land, without connection to their history, culture, traditions, and so on. And in 1860, we have the Indian Lands Act. And what notable there was that in 1860, Britain transfers all responsibilities for Aboriginal people to the colonies. And the Indian Lands Act made sure that the Commissioner of Lands also held the title of Chief Superintendent of Indian Affairs. And this person had the power to dispose of lands reserved for the Aboriginal people, which they had released or surrendered. And there was no power allotted to Aboriginal peoples to maintain self-government. And of course, we get into Confederation in 1867, where Canada puts in place Section 9124, the Indian Act, and asserts jurisdictions over Indians and land reserved for Indians. And in 1869, the Gradual Enfranchisement Act came into place, where basically all of the precursor colonial legislation was consolidated, and it became the Indian Act that we have today. And that Gradual Enfranchisement Act established the governance system that was prescribed then remains unchanged today. And together, the 1857 Gradual Civilization Act and the 1869 Gradual Enfranchisement Act would form the basis of the Indian Act in 1876. So that's the precursor legislation, and I encourage people to look it up and read it and to prepared to be shocked by the language. I'm just giving you some of the main points there. And then you see the third, fourth level with all the bubbles in terms of the systems mapping that we'd be doing on the Indian Act. There's a lot of complexity there, but what I've done is broken them down into that level below it, the 9 elements of the Indian Act. Basically, when you look at the Indian Act, breaks down into 9 elements, and the first is wills and estates. And it's interesting that the Indian Act, you know, from our perspective and the policy perspective, is known as cradle to grave legislation, and that it regulates every aspect of our lives from the time that we are born to the time that we die. And what's shocking to our people when they learn about wills and estates is that you can go down to the city and get your will done for your place on the reserve, and unless the Minister of Indian Affairs authorizes it, your will has no force or effect. And it shows the powerlessness that exists for us within the Indian Act. The second important part of the Indian Act is that it controls the banned list of who is a status Indian and who is not a status Indian. And that power is strictly controlled by Indian Affairs. In terms of chief and council, there's a section in the Act which outlines the limited power that chief and council has. They can make bylaws, and we point out the fact that bylaw, that means you're doing something under somebody else's jurisdiction. And it's very, very limited in scope. And what we found is that you could make bylaws, but they have no force or effect unless the Indian Affairs accepts it. And on the issue of surrender of lands, it says that the lands can only be surrendered back to Indian Affairs. And that, so it shows the power that Indian to have over it. As far as reserve lands are concerned, the same thing applies. That for people in our community, it's the first time that they learn that they don't own the land that they live on. That those lands are owned by the federal government, and that we have very limited flexibility or authority to do anything with those lands. The other important thing that comes from the Indian Act is the whole notion of rights and status. And our people, when we're learning this, and we're looking at the status card and what that means, is that under the Indian Act, we are born wards of the crown. That is that we are orphans on the one hand, and on the other hand, we lack the mental competence to make good decisions for ourselves. So Indian Affairs takes that responsibility, and that's where this notion of fiduciary obligation arises. The other thing is that our people learn for the first time that as Indians under the Indian Act, that we are born without full legal status and capacity, which every other Canadian citizen is born with. And when our people learn those two things, they really begin to question our citizenship in this country. As far as elections are concerned, the Indian Act imposed a band council system on us to destroy our own traditional systems of governance. And when you look at the elections, the power that the minister has is supreme. They can call an election anytime they want. They can, for their own purposes, decide what quorum is. And the last one here is ban monies. And there again, what we're teaching our people is that there are two funds that are held in Ottawa. One is a trust fund, and another one is the capital fund. And we have to apply to Indian Affairs to use our own monies. There are several documented instances where it is shown that even when the whole community agrees we want to use this money for a stated purpose or objective, it has been denied. So the whole point of educating people about this is to, for the first time, have them understand the fact that the Indian Act was not set up for our health and well-being. In fact, the opposite is true. And then we're able to show people the effect that it has had on our inherent right to self-government as a people. One of the biggest things that we experience that hurts us the most is loss of language, loss of culture, loss of tradition, loss of worldview, and importantly, our health and well-being. As far as our lands are concerned, we learned that as a result of the Indian Act, we've been pushed off of our lands, that it was made illegal for us to go on back onto our lands, to use our lands. And on the reserve, we don't own the land that we're on, we live on. In terms of laws and jurisdiction, we learned that as a result of the Indian Act, we have no lawmaking authority and very little policy flexibility to make any kind of change. As far as governing institutions are concerned, our people learn that under the Indian Act, that our traditional forms of government were outlawed and made illegal. And as far as resources are concerned, our people, they learn that under the Indian Act, our people are practically left out of it. And as far as the resources of the territories are concerned, that we don't have access to them in terms of our economy and our ability to look after one another as people. So the big thing that comes out of this is that the people are shocked to learn that the Indian Act was strategically planned to take Indians off of their lands and to put us onto reserve, to oppress us, to destroy our economy, our way of life. And they did it by taking away our children, as evidenced by the 215 graves discovered at the Kamloops Residential School and probably at every other school across the country. And it was designed to continue to suppress us, to keep us there. In Section 9124, kept us out of the rest of the Constitution, now going on for 8 generations. We don't own the land, we're wards of the Crown. We have no legal status and capacity as a natural person. And when I define those two words, a natural person, the definition is a living human being. And our people realize that under this legislation and in our place in Canada, that our citizenship is questionable and we're looked at as less than human beings. And what results from that is shock from the community, In places that have done this, in one instance, the elders were started to stand up and to embrace one another, to hug each other. Another instance, people were getting up and shaking each other's hands and saying, "I'm sorry." And I finally realized the genesis of the conduct, my conduct, and the extensive trauma that exists in our community amongst the people, and the conflict that arises as a result of it. So not only are we looking to build a consensus decision for change, but also the realization for our people that we need to reconcile amongst ourselves first before we can be successful in having clear vision for a better future and being able to establish priorities in terms of what are important for us to do now and to get on with it. So that's the importance of this, Catherine. It's to educate our people who learn for the first time that this was willfully done, and that if we don't change, the Indian Act will continue to do what it was designed to do. And that is shocking to our people.
Thank you, Satsan. That was very powerful. Just before we started, you talked about how hard it is to present this particular material because of what it reveals, and certainly feel the emotion in your voice, and I was affected by it as well. Just before I move on to Francis, though, I'm just for people who are sort of seeing these concepts or the ideas and the structure for the first time. If we could just go back to the chart briefly, Aaron, if you don't mind. You have that sort of middle section that you alluded to called systems. And I think just if you could just spend a couple of moments, Satsan, talking about, because we can't really sort of see what's in those bubbles, but just talk a little bit about the systems mapping that you've been doing and why it's kind of important for people to understand that not only does this piece of legislation exist, it still exists, it's still the basis for the Canada First Nations relationship, but it has over time accreted all of these other sort of policies and systems and structures, which I think is in those bubbles there. So if you wouldn't mind just spending a couple of moments explaining to folks what that's all about.
Well, I don't want to get into the bubbles itself because it's very, very complicated and it's very hard to show up on a screen. But the systems mapping project is designed to show people from a systems perspective where and how the Indian Act came from, what it was designed to do, and how it did it. So when we engage our people on the Indian Act and the effect that it has had on their inherent right to self-government as a people, for example, one of the major things that they come up with is the loss of language. And we need to regain our language. That's the most important thing. One of the most important things. So through the systems mapping, we're able to show the people that the loss of language is systemic to the Indian Act. That was the policy objective of residential schools, for example. The stated policy objective of the time was to kill the Indian and the child. And the result of that was to take away our language so that we aren't able to transmit our histories, our creation stories, our worldview, our culture, our traditions onto successive generations. Similarly, with respect to the land, the systems mapping project is designed to teach people that the reason why we are off our lands is systemic to the Indian Act. It was designed to take us off of there, to get us out of the way, to destroy our economies. And similarly with laws and jurisdiction, we're able to show through the systems mapping of the Indian Act that the fact that we are powerless under the Indian Act with limited bylaw making ability and limited policy flexibility is systemic to the Indian Act. It was designed to take it away. As far as institutions are concerned, we can show to our people the fact that the reason why our traditional governance systems were no longer here and were made illegal is systemic to the Indian Act.
Mhm.
And similarly with resources. So what we want to do there is to educate people that the entire impact and trauma that's associated with the impact with the Indian Act is systemic to it. It's a part of a strategic planned system
Great.
to do what it did.
Thank you, Satsan. I'm going to turn now to Francis Abel. And in fact, Francis, we stole the title of a research paper that you did a number of years ago called Like an Ill-Fitting Boot on the Indian Act, and we're using it in our webinar today. You looked at the Indian Act specifically from a governance and public administration perspective, and in very, to me, stunning conclusion, you said, there are no other citizens of Canada for whom a specific piece of federal legislation regulates their social and political citizenship and the most fundamental features of their social and economic lives. No other groups of people except those who are in prison live so thoroughly under the supervision and control of the executive branch of the federal government. So take us through some of your key findings, Francis, and kind of what brought you to make such a harsh statement in the end.
Thank you very much. When I accepted this assignment, which was, I accepted an assignment from the center, the National Center for First Nations Governance, and they commissioned about 8 or 12 of these studies of the Indian Act. I had never read the Indian Act when I agreed to do this work, as shocking as it may seem. And so my assignment was to read the Indian Act and think about its implications for self-government and for public administration on reserves and First Nation governments. And so I was not asked to do, and asked not to do any empirical research, just to read the text to see what sort of a government it created or embedded in its provisions. And I have to say I did it over one long winter, and it was the most difficult assignment I've ever done, a writing project I've ever undertaken, because in my imagination, I had to live under the Indian Act. The conclusion that I reached was that it had been an actively destructive force in First Nations from its inception. You can see that in so many of the provisions, and that even though people had learned to work with it and there'd been some modifications over the years, even so, the Act is a law, and that law is effectively the constitution of First Nation government. And under the First Nation government, there is still actively reproduced the lines of oppression that were built into it in the very beginning of our country. That was a very difficult realization to come to, but I'm absolutely sure it's true. And like an ill-fitting boot, the Indian Act pinches in all the wrong places. It constrains decision-making in the wrong places, and it provides no support where a government would need it most. So it's an ill-fitting boot. In the time I have here, I can only offer a few examples of this. Some of them Sasan has already covered, and I'll just briefly mention them. First of all, under the Act, virtually every aspect of communal life or social life on the reserve is under the control of the federal executive branch. And what that means effectively usually is under the control of public servants who are working for the Department of Indian Affairs and its various versions. Executive authority is applied to determine who is and is not counted as an Indian, as a registered Indian. And that list is controlled by the federal government. Bands do not have the authority to say, oh, here's a registered Indian entitled to the same privileges we are. Band membership is under the control of the executive branch. As Sasan mentioned, the reserve lands are not owned by the members of the band that live on the reserve. They're held by the Crown. And the Indian Act explicitly begins with that assertion that the reserve lands are Crown lands held in trust for the Indians. This means that effectively, putting that together with other provisions in the Indian Act, it means that bands have very little control over economic development where they live. They have very few levers to do any kind of meaningful economic development. This is an area where there have been some modifications and changes, but the basic structure remains the same. And the agency is taken away from the band government level and held closely in the executive branch of the federal government. Probably most consequentially, there is the authority the executive branch of the federal government has over the structure of government on reserve. And from the beginning, the provision was there must be an elected chief and council elected by a majority every 2 years. There are elections every 2 years. If you think about that for a minute, imagine what would happen to a country like Canada if there were elections every 2 years. Think again about your city, if that were the case. And if all of the funding that city council received and was able to spend came from a single source, and that single source was outside of your control, but under the control of the executive branch of the federal government. That's the position that reserve governments have been in from the beginning. So that basic control that people have as a result of being, the people they elect being responsible to them was never implemented. The Indian Act is silent actually on that point about who the band chief and council are responsible to in the First Nation. They're responsible to the executive branch in a number of ways. I have a slide that illustrates this, and I'll ask Aaron to put it up now so you can look at it. Actually, 2 slides. We'll look at them in order. Maybe not. Well, the first slide is, it's a schematic representation of what government in Canada looks like, which is that the cabinet and prime minister are responsible to the Canadian people through the House of Commons. And on the other side, the services come out of cabinet decisions and are provided to the Canadian people. So there is a cycle of responsibility. What happens in real life every day on First Nation, in First Nations is completely different from that. And when Aaron comes back and puts the slide up, I'll speak to it. It's important that you can see how the lines of accountability go. Crucially, too, there are a few things that are not mentioned in the Indian Act. And this is because it's a piece of fossil legislation. It reflects the way people thought about government back in the beginning of the 20th century. So not only does it have built into it the lines of oppression that Satsan and I have been talking about, but it also has built into it assumptions about how a government can work that have long been discredited. So here's the first slide. This is the one I was talking about. It's very schematic, I know. It's a heuristic model of how democratic government is supposed to work. Could you put the next slide up now, Aaron, please? This is what government under the Indian Act looks like. First of all, you can see that the chief and council, while they are elected by the band members, are actually authorized under the Indian Act and under the control of what's now called Indigenous Services Canada. On a separate line and circumventing the chief and council, Indigenous Services Canada has a legal relationship with the band members who are registered, as long as they are registered Indians. The band administration has a relationship with the chief and council, but it is primarily a creature of Indigenous Services Canada, with the administration under the lines of the Indian Act, and so on. So you can see that the normal normal lines of accountability and responsibility are not present in Indian Act government, even if it were not designed specifically to eliminate Indians as peoples. You can see that forcing people to live under a system like this is going to undermine their political and social life in important ways. Thanks, Aaron. We can take the slide down and come back to me. So in conclusion, I just want to say a few things about what isn't mentioned in the Indian Act. There's no comment on the responsibility of the chief and council to the electorate. There's no envisioning of anything like citizen engagement or committees of citizens that you might find in a small government somewhere else. There's no mention of that at all. There's no discussion of policy development. In fact, the assumption seems to be that the chief and council will not develop policies, but rather will implement the policies that are imposed from outside and above. The normal governmental process of budgeting is not present, where budgets can be used as a tool for multi-year development planning or or to look after social well-being. Instead, the chief and council and the band administration are responsible to the funders, who are always located outside the First Nation and who provide program funding under very specific terms. And this is due to specific provisions in the Indian Act. It's not something that is just a matter of discretion, it's the law. The Indian Act, then, as I'm saying, is a fossil. Its provisions give us a good look at executive branch intentions with respect to First Nations. At its inception, as Sam was saying, it was designed to eliminate First Nations, first to control them, to make sure they stayed on reserve and didn't interfere with settlement of what had been their lands, but later to foster the conditions under which they would either be contained in no trouble or assimilated. Although in practice, there's been some loosening of the controls, this is all still the case. 100 years later, the political imagination of people living in First Nation communities and the political behavior of the people who must live under it and make the system work is still conditioned by what is effectively the constitution of government on a First Nation. I hope I've said enough to make it clear why I concluded with that harsh assessment.
Absolutely.
And you know, I can't resist adding this last thought. After spending the winter living under the India Act in my imagination, the strongest emotion I had was anger. It was very depressing, but eventually I got frustrated and angry because of the tone. And I recommend everyone have a look at the Indian Act and think about what it would mean if the provisions of that act applied to you. It's like the Anti-Constitution Act 1982, which is a vision of how a country should be. The Indian Act is the reverse of that.
Thank you, Francis. I think you explained it very well, and certainly just in terms of good governance and thinking ahead to how do you develop and implement the inherent right of self-government on reserve. Obviously, there's so much conditioning that has been created by the Indian Act that is a significant factor that people have to unwind themselves from in terms of going forward. I'm going to move now to Dr. Terry Passette in Calgary. Terry did her dissertation, doctoral thesis on contemporary First Nations governance, and she covered a number of the sort of colonial legacy issues that both Satsan and Francis have talked about. But in your paper, you talk to how these have contributed to kind of a culture of spinning wheels where change is really difficult. And you looked at particularly sort of one of those cogs in the wheel being the interrelationship of the traditional forms of governance that still existed in many places and the current chief and council system. So if you could tell folks what you found and where specifically you see people kind of getting stuck when they try to make changes to their governing systems.
Thank you, Catherine. Ambawastich, everyone. As you know, my name is Terry Passette, and I'm from the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, Treaty 7. So to understand how the Indian Act obstructs change in First Nations communities, we first need to revisit traditional governance systems. So prior to the Indian Act, the basic political unit for most First Nations was extended family organized by clans. So traditional governance was centered on clan-based political systems. Each clan was represented by a hereditary or appointed kin leader. Leaders received input from clan members and represented their clans at the larger political table. The clan leader was not the decision maker, but the voice of the clan. Rule was by consensus, and every member of every clan had the right to be involved in decision making. No decision was passed until all agreed. In this way, traditional First Nations governance was truly democratic. Consent resulted in the equality amongst clans. No matter what their size was, each clan had an equal say in the political process of their nation. Traditional clan-based political systems were effective, and they sustained First Nations communities for thousands of years prior to European settlement and colonization. While First Nations remained self-governing during early settler First Nation relations, assimilation had been on the mind of the Dominion government early on. This objective was first implemented in the Gradual Civilization Act of 1857. A couple of years later, the government legislated assimilation through the Civilization and Enfranchisement Act of 1859. And the idea here was that First Nations were so eager to assimilate that they would voluntarily enfranchise. But a few years later, government was told that First Nations were resisting, and not a single First Nation person had volunteered to enfranchise. It was concluded that autonomous traditional First Nations governance was blocking assimilation. Government declared that traditional First Nations governance was irresponsible and had to be ended. Based on the belief that representative democracy was a more responsible form of government, elections and band councils were included in the Gradual Enfranchisement Act of 1869 and carried forward in the original Indian Act of 1876. While the minister had final say over everything, band councils became responsible for decision-making through majority rule. This ended the direct democracy of traditional clan-based First Nations governance, where all families and family members had the right to participate in decision-making. It's also important to briefly discuss other assimilation methods, as these also had an impact on First Nations governance. Traditionally, First Nations people lived by the principle of collectivism. Everyone worked to advance the common good of the nation. As part of the assimilation agenda, the Indian Act pushed individualism over collectivism and elevated individual rights over collective rights. It appears to have worked because the general thinking in many First Nations communities today is, what can I get for me and my family, not what can I do for my First Nation. The government also created dependency beginning in the 19th century and used several methods to achieve this. One was the eradication of the buffalo on the prairies. Another was the introduction of government rations. The government also created laws to block our self-sufficiency. The government removed us from our territories where we were living off the land and moved us onto reserves where we couldn't live off the land. And it introduced welfare into our communities. Because after all, First Nations are better controlled if they're dependent. Today, many Indigenous people are dependent, and many tribal councils continue the dependency that was created by the government. Last, education was used as a weapon of assimilation. And the most notorious example of this, the most notorious example of this is the Indian residential school system. However, government only allowed Indigenous students to be educated up to grade 8 because it didn't want Indians to be too educated. It also prohibited us from attending university and having a university education. So in addition to the Indian residential school system, the government also operated on reserve federal schools where the education was substandard. So today, Indigenous adults with less than a high school education is twice that of the Canadian population. So let's get back to how the Indian Act impacted traditional clan-based First Nations governance. The goal of the federal government was to legislate traditional First Nations governance out of existence. However, government failed in its effort to destroy all traces of traditional governance. Despite enforcing elections, the clans remained in place. So essentially, the Indian Act superimposed elections and majority rule onto clan-based political systems. What this did was transform and taint clan-based governance systems. It went from consensus and the equality of all clans to the largest clans forming the majority and having the deciding vote. In this way, the Indian Act created inequality amongst clans. Traditionally, all clans, no matter how big they were, had equal say. Under the Indian Act elections, large clans had more political power than the smaller clans. And today, clans still practice traditional kin-based leadership selection. This is to say that they elect their relatives. Sadly, the Indian Act's promotion of individualism has made some headway, and this is evident in how some large clans use their voting power to advance their self-interest. It must be remembered, though, that First Nations are underfunded and blocked by the Indian Act from economic development. As a result, many First Nations communities are impoverished. There is little to go around. So by electing their relatives, large clans are assured access to scarce resources. Furthermore, the government's creation of dependency has also taken hold. Clan members are dependent on chief and council for jobs, housing, social assistance, and other benefits. Because many family members are also uneducated, they have few options to get work off reserve and become self-sufficient. Thus, in an environment of poverty, dependency, and barriers to self-sufficiency, clans safeguard their survival through block voting. So in the context of elections and kin-based leadership selection, leaders need the support of extended families to be elected and to stay in power. Again, thanks to the Indian residential school system, the federal schools, and the underfunding of First Nations communities, many leaders do not have education or training. This means that they have few job opportunities outside of council. So they fear how they will make a living should they be ousted. Their self-interest lies in keeping their positions. Leaders are often pressured by supporting clans to give them what they want. So they engage in favoritism to keep the support of the relatives that elected them. When I was doing my dissertation research, one of the chiefs that I interviewed said that if big families do not want change, you can bet that there will be no change. Large clans can use their voting power to keep the status quo leaders in place. They can also vote out leaders that try to make improvements. Again, I interviewed another chief from another community who had been ousted for trying to make change. And he said to me, I tried to make change, but the people taught me that's not what they want. I'm mindful that under the Indian Act, change is exceedingly difficult to begin with, but the impact of the Indian Act, elections, and majority rule on clan-based systems results in a culture of spinning wheels. In my community, it's hard to get traction for change because the large clans, for all the reasons I described, consistently vote in the same leaders and keep us stuck in the status quo. We just keep spinning our wheels. And I know from my dissertation research, because I interviewed leaders, community members, elders in BC and in Alberta, that my community is not an anomaly because many other First Nations communities experience the same thing. So thank you, Catherine, for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Terry. Until I read your paper, the whole, that specific point about how the Indian Act actually probably subverted a much more straightforward democratic system in communities had never really occurred to me. So, thank you very much, and I think it probably gives a lot of members some insight into some things that may be happening in their own communities. I'm going to turn now to Dwayne, who, as I said, has been at the front lines for many years as a senior administrator of band governance under the Indian Act. And I thought, Dwayne could give us some very concrete examples of, what it's like to work day to day under a system like this. And I guess I would ask you, Dwayne, that, in addition to some of those concrete examples, and what is your reaction to what you've heard from colleagues and partners today? Does it resonate with you? Are there some things that you would challenge? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Miigwech, for having the opportunity to share some experience today, and this is also thought provoking, and my head just swims with examples and experiences of all of the things that have been outlined by Satsan and Francis and Terry, and so I think maybe the best thing for me to do in a relatively short period of time is to maybe share a few examples and then some of our responses, because to moving out from under the Indian Act, and this is a very complicated process because it's very ingrained
It's very ingrained in the minds of bureaucrats in Ottawa and Toronto that we deal with. It's very ingrained in the minds of the people here in our own minds as administrators and bureaucrats. We, one of the things I learned early on in my role is that we had to challenge our own thinking first in order to change, and then worry about the community and the external influencers, and that's something that we took on early on in my time here. I'll just share an example of that kind of thinking, maybe that kind of, because it's changing thinking that's going to change the way we do things. I can recall a circumstance many years ago now, where we had a mother move home to the First Nation. She had two very young twins, and one was very ill. They were infants, and she couldn't get any help in the larger urban center where she lived, and she came home, because that's what we tend to do. We know there's always that place for us. And when she came home and had this very sick child, there was this institutional response from part of our organization. We had our child welfare workers involved, because the mother had a lot of different issues on top of historical trauma and everything else, family trauma. So we had our child welfare people helping out, and then at the same time we had other people in our health center who were saying, "Oh no, she can't come back here. We don't. There's too much liability. We're going to be questioned by these external agencies about how the resources this is going to require." And that was like a point in time for me where I just said, like, we can't do this anymore. We have to start, thinking as Anishinaabe people here and solve the problem the way our grandparents would have solved the problem, and that is they would have come together and they would have figured this out. And we call that concept widoktadyam, working together to help each other. And that sort of crystallized within our organization, and we started to try and shift the mindset away from worrying about what the external influencers and funders and reporting relationships that were in place, and start focusing on what the community need was, and tailoring our response in our own way. So, I mean, that's just an example of the types of thinking that's sort of, that kind of exists, that you're not even necessarily always conscious of. But I'll shift quickly because I know I don't have a lot of time, but I want to talk about some other examples specific to the Indian Act. At Nipissing here, in 1904 and 1907, over the course of a total of 3 or 4 days, about 2 townships worth of land, about 50,000 acres of land, were taken by Canada. So the Indian agent came, had 1 or 2 public meetings on 2 different occasions, and basically secured the surrender of large swaths of reserve land. And immediately, the community started to protest what the Indian agent had done, and that was an effort to get that land, because there was some very high timber values on there, and the government wanted to sell that off, and the Indian agent had promised that the money would come back to the people, and of course it never did. And in fact, the lands remained unsold for many years, and the community tried for decades to restore that land that had been taken over the course of a couple of days on 2 separate occasions for decades, and succeeded in 1995 in getting an agreement to return those unsold surrendered lands. And I can tell you, to this day, those lands are not returned. We have an agreement from 1995. It is still not implemented. We are toing and froing because of the Indian Act, because of the land tenure issues between provincial and federal jurisdiction. Now this land doesn't have any title. We've just taken it up and started to use it, but the fact that the government of Canada won't issue an order in council to return those lands to Nipissing First Nation is completely constrained development. You know, we've just gone ahead and started building a business park in there because it's NFN land. That's the exercise of jurisdiction. It's our land. We're going to do it, but it comes with a lot of risk. There's a lot of practical risk there. You know, you try to secure grants to support the development through regional agencies like the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund or FedNor. You know, and the first thing ISK says is that land tenure is not secure. You know, and we're saying, what are you talking about? It's always been Nipissing First Nation land. I mean, and that's a real current legacy issue that we have today. You know, on membership, we have grandparents who have some grandkids who have status, others who don't. So, some of those grandchildren of theirs, they worry about how they're going to get support for health or education or even to play sports, you know, but because all of those external funders, all those external relationships we have all say, oh no, you can't count them. They don't go into our calculations. We don't think about those. Those are Nabizing, Deben, Ogzoad. Those are people who belong to Nipissing. And so you know, this is the kind of problem solving you get into now, right? Especially as you get multiple generations of this starting to happen, where you have very close family connections, those clans in that are still intact, but you know, the Indian Act fracturing things all over the place in terms of practically providing support to people. You know, that impacts health services. That impacts, you know, because some people are eligible for some services and some aren't. You know, that you know, in all of the reporting relationships, again, you know, you have priorities being set externally in places like Ottawa or Toronto that get imposed locally that make no sense, you know, and that's still happening today. And we've just, you know, again, tried to reinforce that we don't tell young mentality, and that is we're going to do it our way and we'll let them figure it out, you know. So child welfare, that's a whole other area, right? In Ontario here, we have a 1965 welfare agreement between Ontario and Canada that decides what happens with our kids here. You know, so we're writing laws, we're participating in development of child welfare laws, looking at options, and Nipissing here has been very open towards taking, you know, practical steps towards things. You know, in all these areas. And I know I'm getting short on time. I'm going to finish with a couple of things. You know, there's a lot of irony in that we settled a different land claim in 2013, and we were compensated for $124 million for the loss of 100,000 acres of land because the survey was improperly done. And, you know, the ironic thing is we have a whole system set up that empowered the chief and council under the Indian Act. And now the government doesn't even trust turning these funds over to that Indian Act government. We had to create a separate trust, you know. And what is a trust? A trust is a fiduciary relationship in which one party gives another party the right to hold title to their property. So it's still Canada viewing those resources as their property being turned over for the beneficiaries, you know, and they don't even trust the elected responsible government here to do that anymore. So now we've created a third entity. It's like, you know, it's like a rabbit hole inside a rabbit hole. And so how do we, you know, what we've tried to do, there's two distinct examples of what we're trying to do in response to this, because it's really about, as Satsan always says, it's about shifting what's happening in here. It's about shifting the way we think. And that is, you know, we're very focused on restoring language and culture here, because when we restore our language and we start to speak the language, we can start to think in the language, and we start to dream in the language. And then that shifts our way of thinking. And you know, and I'm convinced that that rewires our brains, our neural pathways, you know, and I think, and so that's something we're pretty focused on here, you know, and what is the real role of a clan, you know, to Terry's point. And I'll just leave you with one example of how this worked at Nipissing, and I'll finish with this point. You know, for years and years, when there was a controversial issue here and people were challenging the chief and council, people say, well, what does the minister say? How will the minister intervene in this? We're going to go see the minister. And in 2013, about the same time we settled that claim, we finished writing our Chinook Nagawin. And our Chinook Nagawin is our big law. That is the constitution of Nipissing First Nation. It is the articulation of who the Nibizing and Anishinaabe are. And as soon as we implemented that, people's minds shifted right away. And people no longer asked about the minister or Indian affairs. They said, is this in line with our Chinook Nagawin? Show us where this reflects the will of the people, you know. And that was like a watershed moment for me. I'm very proud to have been a small part of that, because, you know, people are now holding their own leadership more directly accountable. They're not looking externally for validation. You know, we're taking it on ourselves. Anyway, I'll stop there in the interest of time, and appreciate the opportunity to share a few of those thoughts, and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Dwayne. That is fascinating. I love talking to folks like you who, I think, and with your political leadership, we're doing amazing work in spite of all of the constraints and the ways that you've been shaped to think about things in the world. I know we're going long, and I had promised, or I had said we might go to 1:30 and maybe even 2 at my time. And I think, considering the conversation and the questions in the chat, we will keep plowing through. And I really don't want to lose an opportunity to hear from Dr. Naomi Metallic from Dalhousie, Indigenous law expert. Naomi, you know, I have heard this question asked many times, and I think it's even been tried a couple of times in Parliament. You know, why don't we just get rid of the Indian Act? Or, you know, what are the alternatives to this hugely terrible and complicated system that nobody seems to like, that we're living under? I mean, what do you see as some of the sort of legal and maybe even constitutional, referencing back to Satsan's opening remarks, solutions to some of this? What are the things that we need to be thinking about?
Great. Well, thank you very much. Waldasi Begisingistuk. I am happy to be with you today. So I guess the way I'm going to tackle this question is probably from maybe not getting into the mechanics of the various types of you know, solutions that are available, but I'll say that I agree with, you know, Satsan and Francis and actually all the panelists, you know, talking about how the Indian Act has conditioned First Nations political imagination, about how we, you know, see ourselves and what we're capable of. And, you know, they've all made the point that there has to be a change in mindset, or what some people call a paradigm shift. You know, as has been hinted at, there's a lot of work we can be doing on our end, revitalizing language, as Dwayne was talking about, revitalizing our law, engaging the community deeply in this work, and thinking about how we govern, and you know, helping our community see that we have solutions in our ways of knowing and seeing the world, and in our language and in our stories. And so that really important work has to happen, but I think there can be an important role for Canadian governments and their courts in making space for Indigenous authorities and laws. Basically them reconciling to our jurisdiction and laws, having their own paradigm shift, if you want to call it that. And I think that this can take different forms, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think in the same way that the Indian Act has conditioned First Nations political imagination, the Indian Act and how we approach Section 9124, the Constitution Act, and even Section 35, and I think colonialism and more in general has stifled Canadians' political imagination about how they can interact with Indigenous people. I think, and a lot of it goes back to how I think we've been steeped in these ideas that really go back to, as Sassan was saying, the doctrine of discovery, and that we don't see treaty relationships as, you know, the sort of the mainstream view of treaties is almost as if they're one-time land transactions or something like that, as opposed to the basis for relationship. I think, you know, the colonial mindset for a really long time has been simply that Canada controls, you know, the land and all the people in it. And yes, we divide that up between the provinces and the federal government, but that being the idea, and not seeing Indigenous people as being able to manage their own affairs, as well as having claims to broader land and resources than just, you know, teeny tiny little reserves that make up 0.2% of all the land in Canada. So I think there's that paradigm shift that has to happen on that side, just as much as the paradigm shift has to be happening in First Nations communities. So we've all been steeping in the tea of colonialism, to put it another way. But I want to talk about the role of law. And, you know, I do approach this as somebody who's been working in law for about 20 years now. And one of the first things that you learn about law that I don't think we really get our head around is people who don't study it. I think people think that law is rules and it's hard and it's rigid and it's difficult to change. But when you start studying law, in fact, you learn that actually law is quite malleable and everything can change, right? And everything that we, you know, currently see as the rule or the way that things are, that can all change. And it often does change. And we have seen, you know, tremendous change, you know, even in, you know, some periods like, you know, 30 years ago in terms of things like same-sex marriage. So laws can change. And, you know, even some things like in the Constitution, we've been talking about Section 9124 of the Constitution Act, you know, that has been interpreted for the last 150 years as giving Canada all the power over First Nations land and First Nations or Indigenous peoples. That is just one interpretation. There are many other people and many scholars these days, including John Burroughs, Josh Nichols, who have put forward that a totally different interpretation of 9124 is possible. Not one that sees this sort of subordinate relationship between the federal government and Indigenous people, but rather one of equals. And that 9124 actually gives Canada the power to protect Indigenous jurisdiction and lands and not exploit them. And so, and this is the arguments that have been made for this different interpretation is deeply based in treaty relationship, and some of it is based also on an alternative view of the Royal Proclamation and paired with something called the Treaty of Niagara from 1774. But my point that I'm trying to make here is that nothing is ever beyond our grasp. It is possible to imagine different and to be different. And it's not, I'm not talking about some like alternate universe. It is possible to interpret our law different. And we have tools that we can use like treaties, also new ones like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that I'll talk about in a minute. So there are different ways that we can interpret the Constitution, like 9124. There's also Section 35 that can be interpreted differently. It's been a helpful tool. Satsan often speaks about Section 35 and the Delgamuukw decision and it being used to recognize Aboriginal title. But there's also lots of people who've been really critical about Section 35 because the way it's been interpreted by the courts is that it still sees the crown as pretty much having all the power. And the court to date has recognized very little Indigenous jurisdiction. And there are people who say, we don't have to interpret Section 35 this way. There are other ways to do it, ones that are not steeped in concepts like the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. So courts are one way to move for this type of change, and we have used that at certain times, but court decisions are also incremental, extremely expensive. There are other ways, lots of tools out there. So let's move to what you asked about, what are other alternatives? There are things that governments can and should be doing to move us forward beyond the Indian Act, right? There can be things like agreements. We've seen modern agreements, but we've also seen more recently governments using legislation as a possible tool for moving forward, including what's called recognition legislation, which is where the government recognizes in law Indigenous people's jurisdiction over a subject matter, and sets in place in the law how it will recognize it, how it will fund it, how conflicts between different laws will be dealt with. That seems foreign to us because the only legislation we've ever known in Canada really has been the Indian Act when it comes to Indigenous people. But if we look elsewhere, if we look to the US, for example, there is a long history of such types of recognition legislation where it's not about subordinating Indigenous people, it's not about exploiting them, but where legislation has been used as a tool for change, where the US Congress has recognized tribal jurisdiction in a whole number of areas. And that's based not on them giving that jurisdiction, but on recognizing the inherent sovereignty of tribes. And setting out sort of the ways in which they will all coexist together. So these laws are sort of meant to be, blueprints about how everyone's going to interact. And these, in the US, this is done very much with the cooperation and full participation of tribes. So there's a possibility of doing this in Canada. Canada's very first sort of attempt at this has already been tried in a piece of legislation called Bill C-92, or an act to recognize First Nations, Métis, and Inuit child welfare. It's about First Nations, Métis, Inuit child welfare. And this is in fact modeled on a similar US law that has actually been in place since the 1970s. But it recognizes Indigenous jurisdiction over child and family service matters, as well as setting out some national standards in terms of the delivery of child welfare services with respect to Indigenous folks. And I think that we're going to see a lot more legislation that is coming with the very recent bill. It just got royal assent last night, Bill C-15, which calls on the federal government to change their laws in order to align with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Basically, I'll say that I think that such legislation can be a tool for good. It doesn't mean they're perfect. There are issues with Bill C-92. It's been criticized for including a lack of clarity around funding, lack of a clear dispute resolution mechanism. Some people have complaints that it's setting too many limits on the exercise of Indigenous inherent jurisdiction, such as subjecting it to the Charter and the Canadian Human Rights Act. Those are all, issues to be debated. But yeah, I think that, even as this, I think we're going to see more of this work happening, and we still have to maintain, a view that's going to continue to hold government to be accountable, assess what they're doing, and calling them on it when they're not doing enough, and trying to lobby for further change, including taking them to court when things get stuck. I think it's going to be hard work, but it's going to have to happen at the same time that Indigenous folks are doing this internal work that Satsan was talking about, but it's all going to be worth it. And the last thing I'm going to say, and I see that it's 2:30, is that I think the UN Declaration is going to be a very important tool in both this, I'll call it external work that, you know, the Canadian governments have to be doing in order to change, as well as the internal work that Indigenous folks are taking on. The articles and preamble of the Declaration are very comprehensive. They touch on almost every aspect of life having to do with Aboriginal people. And these are meant to set out minimum human rights standards that all Indigenous peoples across the world are entitled to, basic human rights. So I think if we use it, if we start to understand what's in it, what it says about Indigenous peoples' collective and individual rights, it's going to be an important tool for us to assess both other governments and even our own government's actions as we push forward for change. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Naomi. Before I let you go, though, one thing that I want to make sure I understand from your presentation, are you suggesting that, you know, we really sort of need the Canadian government and other governments in Canada to, whether it's through court or recognition legislation or whatever, to, in order for First Nations to get out from under the Indian Act and start to advance? Or, you know, as you know, with the project, our premise is that the right to the inherent right of self-government is already there, and First Nations can begin to put in place the mechanisms to exercise it, even without waiting for the federal or other levels of government to approve or create the pathways for that to happen.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying, Catherine, that we need the approval of other level of governments in order to do this work, but I think it's all important work that has to happen. And let me give you a couple examples of why that is. So, you know, there are governments who are, you know, there's some scholars who have talked about that Indigenous people have inherent rights and you got to go out there and just do it. And communities have been doing that. Akwesasne has its own court that is a completely inherent rights court, and it's moving forward with that. But you know, we still need other governments, not to say yes, you can do that. That's not what I'm saying, but we need them to help make space for us, to help us do it in a good way, because communities, I believe Francis was making this point, and so was Terry, but our communities, because of economic and land dispossession, are incredibly lacking in resources, and governments have a responsibility to fund inherent self-government. That's actually enshrined in Article 4 of the UN Declaration. And making this space also adds clarity. That everyone's going to know what Indigenous people can do, so that no one is fighting or coming up to saying to the First Nation, you can't do that. So let me give you an example of a First Nation who decided it was going to develop its own tax system. It was going to use HST that came into the community from its various enterprises, and it was going to put that money back in the community for a program for elders, and they ran it. But CRA did not agree with that. It brought the community to court, and the community was saddled with a $25 million bill to the Canada Revenue Agency, right? So these disputes take us into court. They take up a lot of time and energy. And if it's possible for other governments, which they should be making this space, and we can avoid that and move on with the more important and good work. So that's why I'm saying we don't need their permission, but it would make it all a lot smoother and clearer, and I think better for everyone if they're part of the solution in making the space and providing support.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Erin, can you bring all of our panelists up on the screen now? And I'd like to note that unfortunately Terry had another commitment, so she's had to leave us today. But we're going to get to some questions which have been coming in, a lot of them about jurisdiction. But before that, I just want to both give you guys an opportunity to kind of respond or reflect on what you've heard from one another. But as I do that, one of the things that I want to throw out here that has not, all of you have alluded to it, and I think, Sadlin, you started with the phrase economic strangulation. That has occurred, and Naomi, you just sort of finished with talking as well about economic dispossession. We haven't really talked about the financing of governments, which is, obviously clearly for any government, how they receive the revenues, their control over those, over their resources, and how they direct those funds, et cetera. Is a major part of good governance and governance administration. And so we will have a separate session on sort of fiscal relationships in the future. But just if I could get a couple of comments from each of you on that issue of sort of financing governance, because it is one of those sort of key challenges of getting beyond the Indian Act.
I want to remind people that when Section 35 was included in the Constitution Act in 1982, there was also a Section 36 that was added to the Constitution Act. And it was about fiscal relations, and it had to do with the promise of comparable services in the area of essential services for all Canadians. And so when we were going to the Supreme Court of Canada, I arranged a meeting with our hereditary chiefs and elders with a man named Tommy Shoyama, who was one of the people responsible for Section 36 being included. And we met with him, and he said, "I can't advise you until I know what you want." And through the course of the dialogue, he says, "Oh, I get it. You're talking about self-government." And all of our chiefs and elders said, "Yes, that's what we're talking about. That's what we want. That's what our whole court case is about." And he said, "Okay, now I can advise you. If you're talking about being self-governing, then you have to look at it like every other government in the world. You have to think about, number one, where are you going to get the resources to govern? And secondly, where are you going to get the resources to provide essential services to your people?" He said, every other government in the world, with the exception of a few like Israel, for example, raise their revenue from their lands and resources. And that's what happens here in Canada. That revenue is raised off of Indigenous lands right across the country. Secondly, the revenue is raised through taxation, leases, license, royalties, permits, stumpage, and so on. And the revenue is distributed through a fiscal transfer arrangement in Canada, between Canada and the provinces, and that based on a comparable level of services. So if one province can't buck up and raise its share, then Canada adds more money to the pot, and that's called equalization. So what Tommy Shoyama said to our chiefs was, you've got to insert yourself within that fiscal relationship with Canada. We need to start realizing the revenue and the benefit that accrues and that comes off of our lands and resources. We need to start realizing our share of the tax revenue that's generated off of our lands and resources. And we need to insert ourselves into a new fiscal relationship in terms of the fiscal transfer that happens between Canada and the provinces in the area for essential services, for example. And from our research, we know that in terms of essential services for the Canadian public versus essential services for Indians on reserve, that we receive in the order of 45% less than the Canadian public is used to. So fiscal relations needs to become a critical part of our dialogue when we're talking about implementation of our inherent right to self-government. How are we going to finance our governments? Where we're going to raise the revenue to provide essential services to our people? That's a very, very important question.
So this is work that is near and dear to my heart, and we another project I was involved with an organization called the Yellowhead Institute looked at the history of dispossession of Indigenous people from their lands and their economic resources, and looks at that, but also looks at how in the modern sort of welfare state period post 1950 for the whole country, but how in fact the whole way that Canada funds services on reserve is in fact a form of economic warfare against Indigenous people, and a continuation of colonialism. So I'll put a link to that in the chat. But there are discussions that really, exactly like Satsan says, has to happen around issues of reparations and restitution around the massive stealing of wealth and dispossession from resources. I think too, we have to, in that conversation, open up to Indigenous ways of knowing and being in Indigenous economies, and accepting as a given that Indigenous people do not have to model necessarily Western capitalist modes of economics in order to be successful. And in our report, we looked at different ways to do that as well. So I think that that's very important to put on the table. And also, yeah, that the state has a role to play in finance. I mean, they already do play a significant role in financing essential services across the country, to provinces, to municipalities. So they should be to Indigenous peoples as well. And as I said, this is something that's also underlined in the UN Declaration as well, that here it is, that Indigenous people have the right to autonomy or self-governance in matters related to their internal and local affairs, as well as the ways and means for financing their autonomous functions.
Dwayne, I'm surprised you didn't jump in, because you gave us a really great example of the brick walls that people walk into trying to raise money on their own lands and their own resources, and yet it's unsecured, so then they can't get capital and so on and so forth. So if there was a magic bullet for all of this, what kind of ideal financing would there be for First Nations governments?
Well, I think there's a couple of elements that we have to consider too while we pursue those, obligations that we have to our nations. And that is, we have to, we've worked really hard on building capacity within the nation. Like this is a whole new world that we were excluded from quite deliberately for many, many years, that's opening up now. And now what's happening is, there's a lot of exploitation happening, and we have to become experts very quickly in due diligence and in having capacity in our nations, writing our own laws. We wrote our own financial administration law here at Nipissing, that's in line with our own Chinook Nagawin, that reflects the values of the community. And and why do we have to do that? Because there's so much risk out there. There's been articles in the Globe and Mail for the last 3 weeks about bridging finance and the failure of this major financial investment institution. And a lot of that failure that's not really coming through in the articles was there was a lot of targeting of First Nations by some of the people involved in that, and there's a lot of due diligence that we need to do when we're approached by potential partners or for potential opportunities. And and again, for us at Nipissing, it's providing certainty about what's happening on our land. So we write our own laws. We understand what we're going to permit, the types of activity that we want to get engaged in, the types of partners we want to have, and so that we're prepared, because that's a brand new world, right? Like the world of business, and it moves at a speed that is not consistent with the speed of decision making in our nation. You've got a lot of things running in parallel with this. So not to mention all of these tentacles of the Indian Act that are still, wrapped around us. So we're, at the one hand, we're trying to disentangle ourselves, write our own new laws, and then do business deals at the same time. It's it's all defined by complexity. Those charts of Satsan's are just the beginning.
Oh dear. Satsan, you wanted to make another comment?
Yeah, I think just in the interest of time, I just want to make a couple of comments here. The conundrum that we have, and the reason why we need to educate our people about the Indian Act, is that, notwithstanding that we've achieved the recognition in law and the Constitution of our inherent right to self-government as a part of Section 35, we find ourselves stuck here under Section 9124 of the Indian Act. That's the conundrum that we have. And I think the point that Naomi is making very, very eloquently, and Dwayne talking about, is that we need to be able to understand the tools that we've created and the tools that are around us that we can use to rebuild our nations. And we have to also realize that we have to begin this move from our own perspective. So the way I look at this is that, yeah, there's all these legal and constitutional tools there and legislative possibilities and so on. But we need to come at it first from our own jurisdiction. And we need to put in place our own laws. Because in the absence of putting in place our own laws, there is no jurisdiction to reconcile. And the court has given guidance as far as that goes. And when we put in place our jurisdiction and our laws, the Supreme Court of Canada has said that the Crown might have to amend its policies, it might have to amend its regulations, it might have to amend its legislation, or it might have to come up with new legislation. And so these things are very, very critical, especially to the Canadian public, because when you understand the situation that we're in and why we need to get out of here, we need you to come in as allies for our work. And beyond that, we need you to come in as accomplices to help make this happen. When we went to the Supreme Court of Canada, our objective there was to take our rightful place on our own lands and then within this country called Canada and within the Constitution. And we feel that we've accomplished that we've created jurisdictional space under the Constitution to put ourselves there as a third order of government from our pre-existing sovereignty, which doesn't come from Section 35, doesn't grant us anything. We already had it. We still have it. Section 35 just recognizes and affirms and protects. So the point of this work around the Indian Act for our people is to build a consensus decision for change, because in the absence of making the decision to change, it isn't going to happen. And we need to be able to visualize where we're going. We had national governments, all First Nations across this country. We had many, many communities that make up our nation. And each of those communities had their own governments as well. Jurisdiction was clearly understood from our national governments and our community government. And so the way I envision this moving forward is when we can put in place our own inherent right to self-government, that these laws under the Indian Act, Section 9124, will no longer apply to our people and our communities, but our own laws will, and our own jurisdiction will. And I suspect, I feel that we're going to come from our traditional place first. That's what people want. And then we have to take into account the modern day situation and the fact that things have changed. So there might be possibly a hybrid style of government that's put in place. That depends on the people. It has to come from what the people want. So that's the importance of this work around the Indian Act.
Thank you. Any reactions to that, to our other panelists?
Satsan was so eloquent. I wanted to just think about that for a minute, but the Indian Act is a blight on our country. It's not just a problem for Indigenous people. And as long as we are living with that, we're all trapped in it. And I think, you know, as much as we've been talking about the limiting force of the Indian Act in First Nation communities, we should be talking about the same thing within the federal government. And I've seen generations of students go to work in that department full of idealism and hope for change, only to be trapped in path dependency in a system that itself is designed to replicate what I would call Indian Act thinking. And so we have to think about this as a two-part process. There's lots of work for those of us who are not First Nation people. They're not living on reserve. We can think about how to reimagine a relationship between the Crown and First Nations that doesn't involve the bureaucracy that bears the legacy of all those decades of oppression and the attempt to obliterate Indigenous people. We need to work on something else. But it has to be in response to what is coming from First Nations. Otherwise, we'll just replicate the oppression. It doesn't do any good to pretend it's not there like that. That's a lot of work. Think about what has happened.
Thank you, Francis. You will have noticed that I didn't go to the Q&A box. There were a number of questions related to sort of jurisdiction and reconciling jurisdiction. And we will get to those in later webinars. And I think you heard some of the answers to those questions, particularly with the Satsan's last comment. So in the interest of letting our audience finally go and get some lunch, perhaps, depending on where you are in the country, I'll say thank you very, very much to all of you for a very illuminating discussion. I learn something new every time I talk to all of you guys. And I hope our audience did too, certainly seeing from some of the chat conversation. People have been very, very grateful for the time that all of you took today to share your thoughts and your expertise on some of these important issues. And as we heard from all of you, this is exceedingly complex. The Indian Act itself and what it did to this country and to First Nations people was a work of generations. Satsan, I know you've talked about the hard work ahead will also be the work of generations. Many communities have already started. Others are joining, and it's a matter of perseverance to see it through. We do have the tools in the toolbox now. So thank you everyone for taking part. Yes, it has been recorded. It will be up on our website, on IPAC's website in a few days. Can never guarantee, but certainly within the week. Some people have asked for copies of some materials. We'll see what we can do about that. Satsan, your chart was particularly popular, so we'll have to talk to you about IP on that and how you want to, what do you want to do about distributing it. Our next session is in September on the 22nd, where we'll be actually looking at Section 35 and its contents. It's called, it's a full box, the historical struggle for recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights. Zach, I saw you join the picture. Did you want to get in on anything here before we say goodbye?
No, just want to say thank you to everyone and to all of our fantastic panelists.
Okay, thank you, Zach. And we wish everyone a safe and happy summer.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
To the panelists, thank you so much.
Good one.